Hello and welcome to this episode of Macro Sutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and now we have a new RBI governor. He's taken over, Mr. Sanjay Malhotra, and he has a whole set of challenges before him. It's not going to be smooth sailing. To discuss what these challenges are, we have with you Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us. So now, Radhika, as I mentioned, there are a whole bunch of challenges, but one of them is to do with growth.
Right.
So we know that Q2 growth was surprisingly low at 5.4%, but Q2 also ended at the end of September. Since then, a lot of time has elapsed. So what do we know about growth after that period and looking ahead? What's the outlook?
So because the Q2 numbers came in at 5.4% and it was expected that the September quarter growth would experience a slowdown. We spoke about it also. But the numbers were much lower than expected.
Right.
And therefore, the RBI's recent monetary policy meeting that it concluded last week, it has actually revised downwards the growth projection for the entire year by 60 basis points. So the earlier projection was 7.2%. Now the projection is 6.6%. So now, and even after that, a lot of other organizations, agencies have also revised downwards the growth projection for the full financial year. So September was exceptionally, subdued growth. And as if we compare it with Q1, we see that, in Q1, in fact, the internal dynamics were quite good in terms of the fact that manufacturing did well, consumption was doing well. But in September, even these two engines of growth did not experience a good growth. Manufacturing, in fact, slowed to 2.2%, and investment, construction, the two main engines of growth, also slowed. So now, if we look at the period ahead, we are getting a mixed picture, and therefore we need to see more data to form an assessment about the growth. So we need to see what happens to the October-December quarter as such. We look at the corporate sector, we look at the project data, and all of that will be clear only in the month of January, that we'll have some numbers. The big numbers about the state of investment, about the corporate profits, the sales of companies, because we did see that manufacturing sector did not perform well even before the GVA number for manufacturing came out. Right. So we can get an assessment when we have the company's data. But if we look at the data that we currently have, for example, the IIP number came out today. It shows that there is a improvement to 3.5%. If we look at car sales and other demand proxies, there also we see an improvement. But if we look at, again, bank credit, it's showing us a slow growth, again due to bank credit to NBFCs is slowing down. Right. A lot of it has to do with the regulatory changes that were introduced last year to stem the growth of credit, to stem the interconnectedness between banks and NBFCs. So we are getting a mixed picture, and I think picture will get more clearer when we have the quarterly data on companies and sales. But right now, it's at least better in terms of some high frequency data is showing better. But overall growth engine that was performing quite well last year, it seems to have slowed, and urban demand seems to be a problem.
Right. And even the RBI, in its latest monetary policy committee, the announcement that they made, even their projections for Q3 and for Q4 were lower this time around than in October.
Yeah. That's why the whole overall growth is also lowered by 60 basis points in a span of 2 months.
Yeah, meaning that the slowdown for the year was not only because Q1 and Q2 was slower, but also looking ahead.
Absolutely.
Right. So now, of course, the RBI, it has to balance growth with inflation, and it's particularly very strict about getting inflation down to the 4% mark. We know that in October it came in at 6.2%, which is higher than even the RBI's upper limit. Absolutely. And this time around, November, the latest data is showing that it was at 5.5%, which is within the comfort band, but still quite elevated. Right. So what is the outlook for the rest of the year, and what is the challenge for the RBI?
Yeah. So, see, we spoke about growth, and typically, if growth is slowing down, the monetary policy response should be to cut rates. But again, the task is complicated for the new RBI governor because while growth is slowing down, inflation is still elevated. Even with the latest data, we see that inflation is 5.5%. It was expected to ease from October number. October was 6.2%. It was expected to ease, and going forward, it will ease. Seasonal dip we see during winter months, particularly vegetable prices are expected to decline in the coming month. But again, as the RBI's own monetary policy statement points out, that there are several upside risks to inflation outlook as well. One of them being that globally vegetable oil prices are again picking up, and therefore that has concern for domestic food prices, not the vegetable but the other components of food. And the other major hurdle is again the climate change, which will continue to render the inflation outlook uncertain. So in sum total, RBI has again revised its inflation projection also upwards by 30 basis point. So earlier projection was 4.5% and now it is 4.8%.
For the full year.
For the full year. The
Right.
point to note here is that, now the entire composition of MPC has undergone a change now.
Yes.
And that has implications to thinking about whether February will see a rate cut or not, because the two most important members who were advocating for a rate hike, the hawkish members, one of them, Mr. Shaktikanta Das's tenure is already over, right. And Deputy Governor Patra's tenure ends in January. So these two members were most hawkish, and they were more concerned about inflation, and they spoke about the last mile of disinflation. They also mentioned that the RBI's contribution or the MPC's contribution to growth could be through price control. So they say that as MPC, the foundation to growth can be laid through stable prices, through low prices. So now those two members are gone, and with a new RBI governor joining and with a new deputy governor joining in January, we might see a movement towards a more accommodative stance.
Especially since even in the last Monetary Policy Committee meeting, two members already dissented against
the status quo, and
right.
they voted for a 25 basis points rate cut. So all these things, hawkish, dovish monetary policy, accommodative monetary policy, all these will be seen. So February is going to be an interesting MPC to now understand the views, because we were quite aware of the views of the previous RBI governor, that he was more concerned about inflation. And he said that contribution of MPC to growth could be through inflation control. Right. And now we have to see that, and we've also seen that there seems to be a dissent between government and RBI's MPC, where some members, some politicians saying, some ministers saying that RBI should cut rates to stimulate growth. So all these will shape the decision. But there is, again, we'll talk about this, another angle to this is the exchange rate management.
Yes, and we'll get to that. But overall, yes, usually February is a very, very interesting month because Feb 1st is the budget. Yes. But now on top of that, soon after that, there's going to be the MPC meeting. So there's a lot to look out for in February. But yes, as you mentioned, the exchange rate, now the rupee has been falling every day. It's been hitting record lows. And the RBI has been stepping in to kind of maybe even stabilize the decline, maybe not stop it. Because I don't think it can stop it, but to at least stabilize it, it's been stepping in using its forex reserves. So that's also a challenge now before the new RBI governor.
Yes, and all these three are interlinked. Right. Because if they think that inflation is going to ease and therefore they can start the rate easing cycle, there is another dimension that they have to look through, which is the exchange rate management. And as you rightly said, rupee is under pressure, and if they cut rates at a time time when the US Fed might not go in for an aggressive rate cut, that will have further implications for the rupee. Rupee may fall further. In fact, if you notice, with the day the announcement of Mr. Sanjay Malhotra becoming the RBI governor, rupee declined because there was this expectation that now the interest rates would be cut, and therefore rupee depreciated, in the offshore market, and that had implications for the onshore market the next day. So exchange rate management, the strategy of the Reserve Bank in the coming months will be extremely important, and it will have implications on for their rate cutting decision as well. So as you pointed out, rupee is under pressure due to various factors that we discussed earlier, the outcome of the US elections, the FPI selling, though of course now FPIs have turned buyers, but rupee continues to remain under pressure. And RBI has various instruments in its armory to manage exchange rate, one of which it is doing, which is intervening in the spot market, the onshore market. By what it is doing is it is selling dollars and absorbing rupee. And in that process, there are two implications: that when it is absorbing rupee, the liquidity comes down. And the other is that forex reserves also come down. So now we saw that in the October policy, the RBI in fact cut the cash reserve ratio by 50 basis points. Sorry, December policy, the latest policy, the RBI cut the cash reserve ratio by 50 basis points because they were concerned about the anticipated tightening of liquidity. To some extent, liquidity is influenced by the advanced tax outflows, GST tax payment, but also due to the RBI's intervention policy.
So they know that they're going to be intervening.
They know that they're going to be intervening. They would have to intervene, and therefore they have taken this measure of cutting the cash reserve ratio by 50 basis points in two tranches. So one is the RBI is intervening in the spot market by selling dollars and buying up rupees, which has implications for liquidity. But the other important a change that has happened in the exchange rate management in recent months is that RBI is now also taking positions in the offshore market, the offshore non-deliverable forward, where there is no actual delivery of currencies. It is just on the basis of the profit and loss. It's forward at what price you are buying, and then at what price you are selling at a later date. So the difference of that purchase and sale price would get reflected in the RBI's balance sheets. So there is no implication on the foreign exchange reserve. There is no implication on the liquidity, but it will have implications on the RBI's balance sheet, on profits and loss. And therefore, we are seeing that right now, if you look at the data, so we have data only till September, the net outstanding sale position of RBI has risen to $14.5 billion. So if you look at the April to September data, we see that in most of the months, RBI is a net seller. Right. In the non-deliverables offshore forward market. And in some months, in fact, we saw in September, it's very interesting that in September, RBI was a net buyer, and in fact, its forex reserves increased to $700 billion. Whereas in the offshore market, RBI is seen to be taking a opposite position. It's taking a short position in dollars. So whether it should continue with this strategy, or whether it should intervene in the spot market, or whether it should allow rupee to depreciate, given that if we look through the lens of the real effective exchange rate, rupee is still appreciated. Rupee is the value, the REER, the real effective exchange rate is 104. So in that sense, it is overvalued as compared to its trading partners. So this is again another challenge or another decision, another strategy that the new governor has to think about. What will be the exchange rate management strategy? And if they decide to manage the rupee, to what extent and in which market? Is it good to intervene and take position in the forward market? Small positions or big position? Because if we look at some of the reported news on this matter, it says that the outstanding position in the October-November has risen further. So to what extent should a central bank take positions in the forward market, in the non-deliverable forward? Is it encouraging more speculation of rupee trade? So all these are again very important questions for the governor to think about, and also to think about in general about RBI, about the rupee, because it is certain that dollar is going to be strong, at least in the near term. So in an environment where dollar strength is a given, what will be the strategy on the rupee, because that has implications for interest rate policy as well.
So then, I mean, it of course also it helps in this situation to have a civil servant in the RBI as the governor, especially somebody who's worked in the finance ministry, because all of these things that Radhika has been talking about requires very close coordination with the government as well, with the Ministry of Finance and with the other secretaries in the Ministry of Finance. So it's a good thing that he at least has a working relationship with the minister, with his previous colleagues in the Ministry of Finance. Now, we've talked about like these are all his challenges in the short to somewhat medium term. But over his term, he has a term right now of 3 years. So there are also certain reforms that he can bring about. And what would some of these look like? You in your article you wrote about reviewing the inflation target, for example.
Right. So that is very important, because in March the review of inflation target is coming up. We know that we are in an inflation targeting framework where once in every 5 years the inflation target is to be reviewed. Right. That is as per the Reserve Bank of India Act, which was amended in 2016. Now, what is important to note is that it is the target which is to be reviewed and not the framework. You know, some commentators understand that this is an opportune time to review the framework as such, or to talk about the fact that the target should change from headline to core. No, it's current law does not allows that.
It's just that the number,
the target of 4 plus 2, whether it should become 5, it should become a point target, it should become a range, should the range narrow? These are the policy questions that the legal framework in its current form allows. If you want to make other changes, then the law would need to be amended for that. If you want that once in 5 years the entire framework needs to be reviewed, then that's a separate question. So now that is coming up, and that requires, again, as you rightly said, it helps to have a civil servant as RBI governor, because again that requires a close coordination between the RBI and the government to think about what is the optimal inflation target for India. Should it be increased given the various challenges, given the multitude of exogenous shocks that the economy is facing in the form of climate, in the form of protectionism, where tariffs are rising. So all these are healthy debates, and this is again another important development that will happen in the new governor's tenure after 2 months. And this is again something to look forward to, that what are his views, what are the government's views about the target, because again that will shape the interest rate policy as well.
Right. And now we have a few questions from the audience, which also come with quite a bit of commentary, which, by the way, I have truncated because, I mean, some of them were quite long. So, Sankalp, he says that both the fisc and the monetary sides were way off their GDP estimates of Q2. The latest response from the RBI was to cut reserve ratios, but the broad macro indicators indicate a demand stress rather than a liquidity crunch. Why is the RBI not using the wealth effect as a tool to boost demand? Can we expect any creative maneuvers by the new RBI boss? And also, have we been pushed into stagflation?
So again, see, stagflation is something, it's a very strong term, and my opinion is that we need to wait for a few more quarters to form an assessment about whether Indian economy is into a stagflation. Definitely growth has slowed down, and projections are showing that growth would be around 6.3 to 6.5%. But at the same time, we need to look at what happens to growth and inflation. That is number one. Second is that currently the RBI has the MPCs, the Monetary Policy Committee has just one tool. So we can't talk about maneuvering at this point in time,
Right.
because the only tool that is available with the Monetary Policy Committee is the repo rate.
Yeah.
The governor can do other things. We've seen that, the CRR cut was not part of the remit of the Monetary Policy Committee. It was part of the governor's statement and not part of the Monetary Policy Committee. So that is another thing. And so on growth and inflation, I think we need to wait for more observation, because April to June was given that it will slow because of election uncertainty. July to September also we knew. Now we need to see whether beyond the festival effect, there would be some spurt due to the festival effect, but beyond that, do we see an improvement? How much of this is cyclical? How much of this is structural? All of these things are something that need to be seen, and on that basis, an assessment should be made. Cutting interest rate by itself won't help, because cutting interest rate will not stimulate demand. There are other factors. We've seen that there's a lot of discussion about the fact that the wages are not growing in tandem with the inflation. So there are a lot of things that the fisc needs to do. We need to see what happens in budget, what happens to taxation. So yes, demand is a problem, but whether only the repo rate is the answer to demand stimulation is something which is debatable at this point in time, when inflation itself is outside or is elevated.
Yeah, right. And again, we keep coming back to this point, but the coordination between all of the parties at play here, which are the Ministry of Finance, basically from the government side, and the RBI, it's very, very important, because you need a concerted action to address these things. They're very, very key issues. I mean, growth and inflation, it affects all of us, right? So this is something that requires a lot of coordination. And now Anurag says, while people and academicians often discuss economic reforms, there seems to be a general ignorance about how deeply conservative and outdated many RBI regulations are.
Right.
Also, every RBI regulator, every RBI governor has some weird obsession to devise new formulae to dictate banks' lending rates. For economic sake, is there even a remote possibility of meaningful RBI related reforms? Perhaps a long overdue Narsimhan Committee 3.0.
Yeah, that's a very valid question. And in fact, some of the regulations are outdated. There's talk about the priority sector lending, and there is a lot of evidence to show that priority sector lending needs a complete revamp. And in fact, if you see, there is already something called a Regulations Review Authority, RRA, by the RBI, that is, whose mandate is to look into the regulations and suggest streamlining of regulation. I think now is the time to widen the ambit of the RRA authority to suggest sweeping changes to regulations, and how. And here again, very important is that the role of the board is very important. Role of the Reserve Bank of India's board is very important as to how the regulations are made. Whether the amendment is passing through the various checks and balances. A lot of times what happens is that you are making some changes, but that is coming through small change in a circular or a master circular, which is not part of the usual process of checks and balances that normally is accompanied by regulation. So it needs to be, there are a lot of changes are needed. There is a scope for improvement, that every such change should be through regulations rather than through circulars and notices and all these things. And all these require a comprehensive review, priority sector lending being one of them. And here the role of the Regulations Reform Authority is very important. In fact, their role should be, as I said, broadened to include more task to have a comprehensive review of the regulation. And you're right, there's a lot of happening. A lot of things happen through informal communication.
Yeah.
That needs to stop, because as we've seen, there are a lot of these news items where RBI is asking banks to stop taking positions in non-deliverable forward. Sometimes they say you cut positions, sometimes you discourage them from taking positions. So there's a lot of this inconsistency that happens, and all of this can be addressed by having everything done through transparent means.
Right. None of these are
Reported.
decisions that are announced.
That are announced, yeah. So a lot of this happens through informal communication, and that is something I think the first step should be to make everything formal. Every communication from regulator to regulated entity should follow formal means and should be subject to the regular checks and balances.
Right, absolutely. And now, one of the innovative things that former Governor Shaktikanta Das did during his tenure was the introduction of the e-rupee. Right. And so Karthik has a question on that. He asks, where does the e-rupee stand as of today? Will it be able to compete with UPI?
Yeah, so see, till the end of last year, there was a lot of traction and momentum on e-rupee, and there was an increase in the daily transactions also in e-rupee. But now that seems to be losing steam, and therefore I think and no, so it cannot compete with UPI because there is a more established digital infrastructure, and there is a cost to switch from one well-established mode of transaction, mode of payment to another. So, what should be done is now that the RBI should focus more on the wholesale CBDC rather than focusing on retail CBDC. And in fact, if you look at world over, we are seeing that it's not something which is gaining traction or gaining momentum world over. And therefore, most of the central banks, even if they are looking at adopting the digital currency, they are more towards for a wholesale means, that is between the financial institution and for certain specified purposes. And here also retail CBDC could become more important if whatever the previous governor spoke about, programmability features, if those features are introduced, then it can help. But right now there is no value add of the retail CBDC over the UPI. Yeah. And therefore we don't see much, there is not much interest happening after the initial spurt of interest that we saw last year when the pilot project was introduced. And therefore I think the optimal strategy, as I said, should be a move towards more wholesale and identify understand the emerging use cases in the wholesale CBDC rather than in the retail one.
Right. And so there you go. Sanjay Malhotra, our new RBI governor, he has quite a challenging time ahead before him. The next few months, the medium term, basically, he has to balance growth, inflation, the exchange rate. All of these things are interlinked and none of them are easy to handle. And he's going to have to coordinate very closely with the government. The good thing here is that he previously was in the Ministry of Finance, so he knows the people there. He knows Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. He's worked with her before. So the coordination should be easier, but the challenges still remain. But on that note, that's all from us. Thank you so much for watching.